completed your unit circle quiz. You've got it mostly memorized. Some of you have it completely memorized. Now we're going to see how do we do the mental math, or how do we use that so that we can do mental math questions. Now, probably a lot of you used quadrant 1 on your unit circle quiz to figure everything else out. And we do a lot of that when we do our mental math. And I'll show you what it looks like. So if you were trying to figure out sine of 7 pi over 6, it would be really easy to see that your reference angle is pi over 6. So you're thinking in quadrant 1, and you're saying sine of pi over 6 is a half. I now have to decide if it's positive a half or negative a half. So the second thing I have to determine is where is 7 pi over 6. And since that one's on your unit circle, you might easily be able to see that it's quadrant 3. And according to your CAST rule, sine is negative in quadrant 3. So the quadrant 3 tells us it's negative. The pi over 6 tells us it's a half. So this is how we'll try to do things with our mental math. We'll think about quadrant 1. We'll think about the reference angle and what quadrant it's in to figure out the value of sine of 7 pi over 6. Of course, if you have your circle afterwards, you can always double check and say, is this the right y coordinate at 7 pi over 6? So tan of 2 pi over 3, you would think my reference angle in my pi over 3 family is in quadrant 2. So tan in quadrant 2 is negative, and your pi over 3 family for tan is root 3. So for this next one, see if you can figure out the reference angle and what quadrant it's in, and then use that to figure out the value. How did you do? Pi over 4 for the reference angle. It's in quadrant 4 where cos is positive. And your pi over 4 family for cos is always root 2 over 2. So this will be root 2 over 2 as well. I don't know if anybody, you remember that sometimes this can be written as 1 over root 2. So sometimes you see that on a quiz or a test, just to recognize that both of those values are the same. Now, when we get to a reciprocal function, if I want to figure out what secant of negative pi over 4 is, I first figure out what cos of negative pi over 4 is. The angle doesn't flip. Once we get the answer, we'll flip our answer, but we won't ever change an angle. So, obvious that the reference angle is pi over 4. And negative pi over 4 would be going in the negative direction. This is going to be in quadrant 4. So cos is positive in quadrant 4. You could write this as root 2 over 2, or, like I said in the last question, this is the same as 1 over root 2. The reason I put both of them up there, especially for this question, is if you were doing this one and you wrote your answer for secant then as 2 over root 2, perfectly fine. But chances are, if it was a multiple choice question, they would just have root 2 over 1, which is just root 2. So all of a sudden in a multiple choice question, you feel like you know what you're doing, you got the right answer, but it doesn't show up in the answer. It's important to see that sometimes the same thing can be written in a different way. So just pointing that out. Same thing, cotangent, negative 11 pi over 6. I'm going to think first to figure out tangent of negative 11 pi over 6. Obvious that your reference angle is pi over 6. Now, one of the things I find helpful for thinking in the negative direction, okay? We often think first in the positive direction. 11 pi over 6 is on your pi plate, right? It's in quadrant 4. So in the positive direction, 11 pi over 6 goes to quadrant 4. If you think in the negative direction, what would it look like if I went 4 quadrants in the negative direction? 1, 2, 3, 4. It would end in quadrant 1. So I often think about how many quadrants I'm going in the positive direction. That can help me think about going that same amount of quadrants in the negative direction. So now it's pi over 6 family, quadrant 1. Did any of you use the strategy that 3 plus 3 equals 6 for your pi over 6 family to help remember it? Okay? And, of course, this one could also be written like that. So when we do cotangent, it's fine if you write it as 3 over root 3, but on a multiple choice, it would probably be listed as root 3. And here we have cosecant, so we will try to figure out sine. And we notice that this one is part of the axes family. Anytime you have your axes family, find out which point it is. Because the axes family is really easy to remember the coordinates. Negative pi over 2 is going in the negative direction, pi over 2. So we would have that point at the bottom of your unit circle. Sine is your y coordinate. So sine of negative pi over 2 would be negative 1. Then cosecant of negative pi over 2 would be 1 over negative 1, which is negative 1 as well. So each of these were just individual pi plate questions. What makes the pi plate questions difficult is that generally on tests and on final exams and when there was a provincial exam, they usually showed up like this. A bunch of them combined. All multiplied together or added together. So what we're going to do, I'm going to color code this. We're going to figure out secant of 11 pi over 3, put that answer in blue. We're going to figure out cos of negative 5 pi over 4, I'm going to put that one in green. And I'm going to do tan of negative 23 pi over 6 and do that one in purple. I'm going to draw a line here. I'm going to do my work off to the side and then just put the answer in the bracket. So starting with blue, I'm going to figure out secant off to the side here of 11 pi over 3. So what makes these questions hard is you, A, have to have your unit circle memorized. It's going to involve reciprocals sometimes, coterminal angles, so we have to figure out all of these things just to get the value. So for secant of 11 pi over 3, I'm trying to figure this out with mental math. I'm going to first figure out cos of 11 pi over 3. It's easy to tell that my reference angle is pi over 3. But I need to figure out what quadrant 11 pi over 3 is, and this is related to the activity we did the other day. I can think of 11 pi over 3 as a mixed fraction. It would be 3 2/3 pi. So if we think of our unit circle, 3 would take us to the negative x-axis. We're going in the positive direction. 2/3 is more than half. So this tells me it's in quadrant 4. So we have to use coterminal angles, figure out what quadrant it's in, find our reference angle. So I now know that cos is positive because it's in quadrant 4. And I know that cos of pi over 3 is a half. So that means cos of 11 pi over 3 is also a half. And then secant will be 2 over 1. So all that work off to the side just to put 2 over 1 into those brackets. Next, I'll switch to green. I now want to find cos of negative 5 pi over 4. I know that my reference angle is pi over 4. 5 pi over 4 is on my pi plate. In the positive direction, you see that that's in quadrant 3. So if I went 3 quadrants in the negative direction, can you see that this is going to be in quadrant 2? Quadrant 2, pi over 4 family, cos is negative in quadrant 2, so I will get negative root 2 over 2. I replace that. In the green. And finally, tan of 23 pi over 6. I know it's part of my pi over 6 family. (23 pi over 6 as a mixed fraction is 3 and 5/6. 3 will take us to here. 5/6 is more than a half, so this is in quadrant 4. Tan is negative in quadrant 4. Pi over 6 family for tan is root 3 over 3. So there's a lot of memorization and a lot of mental math going on here to figure these out. We have to figure out what quadrant it's in. We have to know the first quadrant of our unit circle so that we can say, oh, tan of my pi over 6 family is always root 3 over 3. We have to know our cast rule to determine is it positive or negative. And then once we have all of those values, now it's just a matter of simplifying. If you're multiplying and you have the same factor on the top and the bottom, you know that you can simplify that to 1 over 1. So I simplified those 2's. Other things we have to remember. You have to remember that a negative times a negative is positive. You have to remember how to multiply square roots. Square root of 2 times square root of 3 is the square root of 6. And on the bottom, 1 times 1 times 3. We will get the square root of 6 over 3. Okay, now, I have some questions for you to practice on these so that you get good at your unit circle, and especially these ones. So I'll hand those out, and I'll give you a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes to work on those.